afternoon to you all, and thank you for joining us today for our discussion on post-patriarchal security, inclusion, and equity for the other 55%. So my name is Elena and Feehan. I will be your host for today. I am a program manager here at Friends of Europe, Pillar for Peace, Security and Defense, and I'm also a member of the steering committee for WISE Brussels. So this is not the first time that Friends of Europe, nor our partners from the Brussels International Center, EUROMIL, or WISE Brussels are talking about this issue. But we think it's still really relevant and important to keep talking about it because women and the LGBT plus community are still discriminated and underrepresented in the security sector. So just to give you some numbers, women make up for an average of only 11% of the military staff in the EU, its members, and the G20, and only 25% of the police officers. If we continue with this slow rate and growth rate, we will have to wait 325 days until we actually reach parity in the EU members. And it would come up to 465 in NATO. So I think we can all say that we don't have that much time to spare. And when it comes to LGBT plus community, we don't have enough data that talks about it. So this just showcases how little importance there's been said and how difficult it can be for LGBT plus community to come out as members in the security sector. So this is why we have asked you all to join us today and to listen and share your experience with our 4 panelists. We have brought an excellent panel of experts and practitioners that have been working on this topic for a long time and at the forefront of equity, for fighting for equity and inclusion. So let me introduce you to them today. We have Hannah Neumann, member of the European Parliament, Alan Sneddon, who's a police officer in Scotland, well, a sergeant in Scotland, and also a member of the European LGBT plus police association. We have also Mary Meigård, member of the board of the Swedish Association for Military Officers, which is also part of EUROMIL, and also Paul Kirby, who is the co-director of the Gender Justice and Security Hub at the London School of Economics and Political Affairs. Before I turn to them, please just let me remind you the rules of engagement. We do want that this discussion can be as interactive as possible, so this is why we would like all of you to raise your hand and intervene if you want so. So please, you can raise your hand on Zoom, or you can write your questions and comments in the chat. Please keep your camera on when you do so, and keep muted until I call your name. And you can come in and please say who you are, your company, and then who would you like to address your question to. Also, please adapt your profile name in Zoom so it can say, have your name and your surname and your company. So without anything else, I would just like to turn to Hannah Neumann. Hannah, so as member of the European Parliament Intergroup for LGBT rights and also the Subcommittee of Security and Defense, you have relentlessly worked to fight for LGBT rights and also to advocate for the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. So what I would like to hear from you is, based on your experience, what do you think that the EU needs to do to further the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security, and also to advance inclusion for LGBT plus members in the security forces? And I would also like to know if you think that the Women, Peace and Security agenda should have a broader approach on gender that also includes the experience of LGBT plus members, or do you think this should be done separately? Back to you, Anna.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me today here and for having the discussion under this very brilliant title, which attracted me from the first moment it popped up in my mailbox. And I'm trying to answer most of your questions, but I'm sure there will be more time for discussion afterwards. First of all, for me as a politician who's trying to make the best political decision, the key is how do we get the diversity that is in the world out there to the decision-making institutions and to be part of the decision-making process, because that's how we can make the best decisions. And so when we see a strong discrimination of women that we clearly see in the security sector, it is very important for me to find ways how can we increase the percentage of women that are involved in the security sector and the decision-making, but also in the implementation. But the question is exactly the same when it comes to LGBTI, because apparently we have a discrimination. We have too few LGBTI people in the security sector. So it's also how can we bring them on board? But it's also about other groups, and that sometimes depends from the context. But in Germany, for example, we still have too few people of color in our security institutions. And here also, I think the goal always needs to be how can we get the diversity of the world out there into our own security institutions. And this is so key for the question of whose security do we actually care for? Because it's often that when people and their perspectives are absent from the decision-making table, their views and their needs are also absent from the decisions that are being made. And then they don't feel represented, they don't feel reflected and by the security situation. And I think especially the Black Lives Matter discussion has clearly shown us what it means when people are actually afraid of the police. Who should be the people to turn to if they are afraid, if they don't feel insecure? And I'm very much aware that the problem is the same for many LGBTI, especially in countries that are offensive to LGBTI rights. We also have some of those within the European Union, but also often for women who, for example, if they have become victim of kind of sexual, gender-based violence, are afraid to turn to the police because of the processes that they would have to undergo. So what could the European Union do? Well, first of all, I really think we need political will from the highest level to change this, because we have so many action plans, we have so many declarations, we have so many strategies, and we even know how it works. But we really need to make this a priority at the top, and that's what I'm also pushing so much for at the European level. And then I think a lot is about quotas. I really think we need to work even stronger with quotas, so make it mandatory that we increase the percentage of, well, different minorities. I think mentoring, cultural change is something, and training. And it's very interesting that when I say training, often people mean we need to upskill women or we need to upskill LGBTI, or we need to upskill people of color to make their way into the police or to make their way higher up. Well, I think we need to especially upskill those who are used to their privilege on how to use their privilege to uplift others. So that for me is also part of any training activity. And I'm very happy you mentioned the Women, Peace and Security agenda, on which many of us base our activism, which sadly has, since 20 years, we have seen 10 Women, Peace and Security resolutions since 2000, taking into account the gendered experience of women. But none of those plans has spoken about the specific situation of LGBTI. So nothing on lesbophobia, on transphobia, and on similar kind of violence. So I think there clearly is a gap. I myself, when I work on this issue, always think from the inclusive perspective, which is why I actually prefer the language of a feminist approach to all of it. And I know that it's sometimes very hard to discuss the issues of LGBT without jeopardizing the women's issues. For example, if we deal with Poland or Hungary, who, even if you just mention the word gender, already start blocking every kind of resolution and policies. So I think here a lot in the next years will be about a pragmatic approach, how we can still in the operations include these aspects. And still uphold the idea also on the on the higher political level. We as the Greens have just issued a paper on a green feminist foreign policy, which has a very strong LGBTI component, but also one about inclusion of other minorities. And I think we should continue to push towards, including just LGBTI as a natural thing in the women, peace and security agenda. Because one thing that is very key for me is we should not fall prey to this divide et impera approach, where we, LGBTI, people of color, women, are kind of starting to compete over resources, starting to compete over attention, but rather really join forces, build an alliance to make sure that the diversity that is out there will finally one day be reflected also in our security apparatus. And well, my arms are open.
So thank you, Hannah. I really like what you said about translating the movements that we already see that are happening in society and train those who have the privilege of being in positions of power to bring those movements in and have the willpower to do them and to implement these many legislations that we also have. And I also it's true that sometimes we see that a competition if we're talking about race, gender, LGBT, and it's true that if we approach it as a feminist, inclusive policy on security, we could go much further. And based on this, I would like to turn now to Alan. Alan Sneddon, you are a sergeant in the police, in the Scottish Police, and you're also a member of the European LGBTI Police Association. And you've been working to change the status quo and to promote inclusiveness from within during 20 years. So this is why I'd like you to talk not only we've been discussing about legislation, and Hannah was saying that there's a lot of legislation on the women, peace and security, and not so much on LGBT rights on the security sector, but going further from the need from policies, I would also like to ask you, how do we make sure that these policies are truly implemented so that members from the LGBT plus community are not persecuted once they come out and openly say, show who they are in the security sector?
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you. I'll follow on from Hannah and say thank you very much to the organisation for inviting me along this evening to talk. I hope my Scottish accent won't be too difficult for you to understand, so I'll try my best to talk clearly and slowly. I often get that comment from people from within Europe when I try to talk, so I'll do my very best for you all. This is a fantastic topic to be discussing, and not just about gender, but also the wider LGBTI issues. Policy into practice is the million-dollar question. How do we translate legislation and policy into reality? There's an expression we often use, which is that we want to walk the talk. So we actually put those policies into practice, and in practice that the policies themselves work. It's all very well having wonderful policies and an array of policies for different groups and marginalised and underrepresented groups, primarily within the security services. However, if we don't actually evaluate those policies and measure the effectiveness of the policies when they are implemented, then we really lose track of the fact that we have those policies and they tend to lead to nowhere. So that is a very difficult one. I have seen a number of policies over the years which have been brought in within the policing sector, which have been great on paper, but in reality haven't necessarily made significant changes to within the organisation. I'm part of an organisation called the European LGBT Police Association, and that is an umbrella organisation that consists of 17 member organisations from each 17 member state. And we work collectively to share best practice amongst each other. And with that best practice, we can then advise our member organisations and individuals how best that they can take that best practice home into their own police forces and deliver that to their force and to the wider community at large. I can give some examples of that, but first of all, I think that the important aspect to remember here is that policy is all very well, but policy has to be driven, and that takes leadership, and that also takes policy that's achievable. So it can't be unrealistic to begin with. You can start from a low base and start building going forward. You then have to have an element of evaluation. So you need feedback not only from within your organisation, from your staff, but also from the communities that you work with. So that may take place in terms of a questionnaire for people who are at the receiving end of service delivery, or it might be a staff survey from within the organisation that specifically asks about the experience of the policy. And the other one is defined outcomes. There has to be defined outcomes that you have a policy that can then deliver on specific areas that are defined and measurable. So achievable, measurable, defined outcomes. That takes me on to what those could be in reality. Well, one of the things that we do quite a lot within the European LGBT Police Association is we go into police academies and we share our experiences of being LGBT within the police service. And we also introduce to officers ways and means in which they can engage with the LGBT communities more proactively and give better service delivery to them. There are a number of things which can affect overall this experience of LGBT police officers and the community, and that tends to be around culture. So although the police service is a much newer institution than, say, the military, historically, that has been a very masculine and heterosexual white organisation. So you have a culture that has developed over many decades, sometimes centuries, which really needs to be rethought and needs to be challenged at times. There are other things which need to be taken into consideration with regards to delivery, and that involves recruitment, but essentially not just recruitment, but retention. So we have people who leave these organisations who are LGBT or are women, and for different reasons. We need to understand what those reasons are and address them. One of the things that could be done around those are things like exit interviews, but also having things like flexible working plans that take into consideration people's lived life experiences. We need to be a bit more flexible in the way in which we attract people and retain people within our policing and security organisations. Also, the way in which we deliver our services. Policing is quite unique in respect to the security side of things, in that our job is engaging with the public, and how we deliver is very important, because the people we are going to recruit from are the people we are going to deliver our services to. So if you have members who are women or who are LGBT in the community and have a negative experience of policing, then they're far less likely to want to go into policing as a career. So it's a bit of both. It's a bit of internal development of policy and practice, but also in terms of service delivery. And those two things are quite key in terms of not only increasing the number of people who are currently underrepresented within the police service, so that can be women, that could be LGBT, that can be people from different religions or backgrounds, cultures, races, but also, we need to ensure that underrepresentation, we understand why that is. And that is why I think the policy to practice area is quite a key and important one.
Thank you, Alan. So I'm very happy that you raised the issue of recruitment and retention, because that's exactly what I'll be asking Marie later on. And yes, I think that the path that you said that the policy should be achievable, measurable, and should have an evaluation makes a lot of sense. And I do think that maybe in this regards, in the One Peace and Security Agenda or the LGBT plus rights, we have a lot of legislation or a lot of good intentions, but then when it comes to implementation, that's where we're lacking. But before I turn to Marie, I see there's already some hands that have been raised, and I would like to turn to participants for a few moments, and then I'll come back to Marie and Paul Kirby. So Emmanuel Jacob from EUROMIL, I saw that you have a question. Please come in and share with us.
Good evening, Elena. Good evening, participants at this, for me anyway, important event. Yes, I have a question, and in a matter of fact, I have two short questions. Firstly, about 2 years ago, EUROMIL co-organized the first ever LGBTIQ event at the NATO headquarters. And hopefully it wasn't the last one of its kind, but let's be positive and look ahead. Now, fortunately, the debate on EU-NATO cooperation is no longer taboo. And a first joint declaration, as you all know, has been signed in July 2016 in Warsaw and identified 7 concrete areas for enhanced cooperation between EU and NATO. Now, however, none of these 7 areas, nor the 74 concrete actions under implementation, pertains to personnel, social protection, or its basic and human rights. Now, my first concrete question and proposal for Anna Neumann: can the European Parliament try to take the lead in putting the issue of LGBTIQ rights in the armed forces on the agenda of the EU-NATO discussion, and in an extension or revision of these 7 areas and associated concrete actions, propose to include gender and LGBTIQ? It would be an enormous support for diverse and inclusive armed forces if these issues were also discussed in the context of the EU-NATO cooperation. My second point, I would like to state that EUROMIL welcomed the first ever European Parliament resolution of October 2020 on gender equality in the EU's foreign and security policy. Anna Neumann was a rapporteur. We welcome the proposal made in this resolution, as well as in the AFET opinion in this, for instance, where they, for instance, called on the High Representative to draw up a gender equality strategy for CSDP missions, with specific targets for both leadership and personnel, and called also on the High Representative to have a full-time gender advisor working on gender equality on the Women, Peace and Security agenda in each EEAS directorate. Now, these are, of course, all very good suggestions, which should not only cover women's rights, but also cover LGBTIQ rights. The European Parliament could further emphasize that the concept of gender includes discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation. And therefore, my question is, does the European Parliament, or more concrete, you as MEP, intends to follow up on this resolution and address the LGBTIQ plus perspective in this follow-up? EUROMIL would in any case be happy to support and promote the European Parliament's and especially your work in this area. Thanks so much.
So yes, Hannah, if you want to answer now, that'd be good.
Sure, I can, and I have to say I'm very happy about the question that you asked and also the documents from the Parliament that you referenced. Let me first answer to you about the EU-NATO cooperation on these concrete projects, where I think you are 100% right. PESCO, as well as the other projects, all focus on the development of capabilities. So it's more doing equipment or doing military mobility or doing like kind of sanitation tents and stuff, but there is nothing so far. And now just that you mention it, I really see the discrepancy that focuses on social aspects, but also on gender and LGBTI rights. And here I'm just taking your suggestions with me, so that next time, for example, when we have a Parliament report that takes stock of PESCO and projects like that, we make sure that we make suggestions in this regard. You asked about the follow-up of our resolution and the demands that we have in there. We are already very strong in my office in following up everything that regards the European External Action Service. So the kind of trainings that they're supposed to do, the kind of whether they senior positions, who's taking them. So we're taking good track of that. I have to admit, we are not that good yet when it comes to CSDP missions, and that is for two reasons. The first one is, and there I would very much hope that we can engage also after this discussion, it's just that they are not so much in the focus of the European Parliament's work, because CSDP missions are, and that's also a bit the problem for PESCO and all the other projects, when it comes to foreign and security policy, and I'm sure you know that, but maybe not everybody who listens to us today knows that. When it comes to foreign and security policy, it's still member states' authorities. So it's member states' decision-making in the council and all of these things, and the parliament can kind of comment. But it's not that the parliament makes a resolution and then the EAS or the CSDP missions really need to follow that. So we have more of an indirect way of influencing this. And I'm just trying to see how much leverage we can have on that one. So here, maybe we should just sit after this discussion, the two of us or the two of us and my team, to see how we can increase our leverage together on this issue. Thank you so much for raising it.
Well, thank you so much, and I think that's great. This is the idea behind this event, to actually bring ideas together, and it's great that Emmanuel's ideas will reach the Parliament. So, as we were talking about the CSDP emissions, I also wanted to point out some numbers that there clearly is a misrepresentation of women here, as only 2 of the head of missions out of 17 missions are women. So clearly something to keep pushing for and keeping an eye on. But also let me go back to Fernando Aguiar. He's also our partner at the Brussels International Center. Fernando, I see you have raised your hand, so please come in and ask your question.
Thank you very much, Elena, and I'm very happy to be back here. This is the second time we are promoting this event with you on a similar topic, and I'm very happy for this great partnership, so thank you very much for that. And my name is Fernando Aguiar from the BIC, and for those who don't know the BIC, we are a think tank based in Brussels, committed to developing solutions to address the cyclical drivers of conflict, including gender inequalities, of course, but both in the Middle East and North Africa. My question would go to Dr. Neumann, but of course, Alan, feel free to answer the question. But as we've been discussing, we know that obstacles and challenges still persist and prevent the full implementation of the WPS agenda. So I'd like to know from Dr. Neumann, but also Alan, if he wants to answer the question, if you can give a concrete example on what the EU's feminist foreign policy will do to address such impeding factors. And do you think the WPS agenda has enough space, or if there's enough political willingness, rather, to incorporate other definitions of gender, including masculinities? So that would be my question to both speakers, but more specifically to Dr. Neumann. Thank you.
Thanks, Fernando. Hannah, again, back to you if you want to respond. Alan, also please let me know if you'd like to come back in, because you can also answer, of course. Hannah?
Okay, and I try to be brief. First of all, what is the added benefit of a feminist foreign policy, or why is it so important? For me, it's clearly to see where do we have discrimination, to really name them, which is already something that can change things. If you just say, but now we have XY number of people in the room and just XY number are women or XY number are LGBT, do you think that this is appropriate? By naming them and then trying to see whatever we can do to make them smaller, but also check all the policies that we have in place where maybe even only unintentionally they even widen the discrimination rather than making it smaller. On the political willingness, being it for the classical women, peace and security, but also being it for being more inclusive on the LGBTI issue, well, I really think we still need to pressure on it. I think, and the pressure needs to be twofold. The one pressure is, how can we get the people who in rhetoric share kind of the assessments that we make to make this their core political priority, to really push for change now, to make out of these strategies a change of reality. So this is, I think, the biggest part of people who, whenever there's a crisis, still fall back to this old pattern of let's solve the crisis first and then let's care about the women's issue or care about the LGBTI issue, and not really fully understanding that maybe one of the main reasons for the crisis is that we still don't do that from the very first place. And that is one aspect on which I think we still need to push a lot, also in EU institutions. The second one is the backlash that we see coming from certain countries, especially Hungary and Poland, but also from certain right-wing or misogynistic groups within all EU member states. And here, just to be very clear and very strict, that we will not allow any of these ideologies to shape EU policies or EU actions. And I think these are the two biggest fights on which we are just stronger the more we are, and the better our alliances are.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. Alan, I see you want to come in as well, so please.
Yeah, just very quickly on the point about gender and the wider gender debate. Yes, that is something that does require a significant amount more work. Gender recognition is something that we are only just beginning to fully recognise and challenge some of the attitudes towards that, some of the negative attitudes. I think from within our security sector and policing sector, we've come quite a long way. However, if you want to, I mentioned earlier on about the culture within organisations, you really need to kind of look at where this culture comes from. And the culture is largely mixed with a degree of masculinity, role model, and masculine toxicity. So you need to try and work out how you're going to adapt the culture within the organizations in order to be more inclusive of people who are then able, through their gender, to take that gender identity into the workplace. And there are many barriers to that. And I think part of that is the cultures within our organizations, which have developed along the lines of gender-specific roles. So, say, for instance, within policing, it was only 30, 40 years ago that women had specific roles within the policing sector. And, that has changed. But, the culture, the underlying culture of masculinity, femininity, and gender identity have come along the way of what would be classified as traditional gender roles. And until we really can overcome those barriers, then I think we're still going to have issues around gender recognition. But I would say that it's very important that when we do talk about women, that we also talk about, the wider gender question and how we can make that more inclusive, particularly with regards to the transgender agenda.
Thank you, Alan. So I think when talking about the culture within the security sector and gender roles, I would really like to bring in Marie Meigård. Marie, you have also been trying to change things from within. You are a member of the board of the Swedish Association for Military Officers. You're a sergeant major in the Swedish Armed Forces, and you've been serving for 25 years. During your service, you have been heavily involved in Women's Network, and you have really been pushing for inclusion and equity in the army. So when talking about about gender roles, I would like you to tell us, what do you think that needs to change so that more women feel that they can join the armed forces or the security forces, and also what can we do to retain them there so they don't feel discriminated and they feel that they can actually progress in their careers?
Yes, thank you, Elena, and thank you for inviting me today as part of this panel discussion. I fully support a more inclusive workplace, which is open to those who are willing and able to serve. The armed forces is a special place to work, and we have special demands for those who can serve. The measures to prevent unwelcome behavior in the armed forces is more important now than ever. We have come far in Sweden, but we still have a long road ahead of us to be even more inclusive. Since January 2018, Sweden reactivated conscription, and the enrollment and conscription is gender neutral. That includes both women and men to do service. Therefore, we have to and we need to adapt the culture, the leadership, everything around it. It's everything from uniforms, boots, body protection, and cultural issues that we have to handle. Recruitment is partly voluntary and partly conscription-based. Individual motivation, interest, and will should always be considered as much as possible. Just like Alan said before about policies, the Swedish Armed Forces has all the policies. We have all the plans. We have a what-to-do list if someone is discriminated. But if that doesn't make an attractive workplace, what does? It's culture, it's leadership. I agree 100%. The successful integration of women into combat units depends on the beliefs on the commanders. If commanders believe women can be successful soldiers and that women are just as capable of men, then the units also will become more accepting of female soldiers. I believe this also applies to other minorities, not only gender, but other minorities. I believe that a strong team is an effective team, and an effective team is a successful team. It's a team where you trust and believe in each other. Your life might depend on it. The success of a mission relies both on task cohesion and social cohesion. So leadership and commanders' belief is crucial to this success. I think that people in decision-making positions in all levels in the armed forces can make a particular difference here. Because if you have the power to introduce changes, you have to take that power. Not only producing policies and plans, but also do things. The organization's core values has to be well known and accepted by all of those who work in the forces. Everyone has to have a sufficient basic awareness about gender and about gender roles and the tradition about the male organization and how we think things about women and men, and that we can do other stuff than that. You have to show strong leadership by speaking up against harassment and discrimination, and you have to follow through with measures. You have to be strong about follow through with measures. Gender perspective should be considered when planning and conducting all activities on all levels. A perspective of gender should be trained in exercises. And since you never know when a gender perspective will become highly relevant, I suggest that you always use it. It's not something you just train or today we're going to think about gender, but think about it always. It is imperative that the core values and the organization march in step. The Swedish Association of Military Officers share the armed forces core values. We share them. And our union leader, Lars Bresker, he says, while the responsibility lies on the leadership in the armed forces, we have an important role to play as a union. We will demand more than statements from the leadership. We demand actions for change at every regiment, at every school, and in every unit. So the enablers for an attractive workplace and to keep women or other minorities in the organization are strong leaders and commanders who embrace diversity and speak openly against discrimination and harassment. Last week, our Supreme Commander in the Armed Forces was appointed Leader of the Year in Sweden. And the motivation was that he has successfully worked for diversity and contributed to the armed forces today being seen as an attractive workplace. And I think if you have a Supreme Commander who sets the context for an attractive workplace and follows through with measures, then all levels will fall in because we have to march a step. It's rule number one. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Marie, and thank you for sharing this. And I think it all comes back to what Hannah Neumann was saying about leadership and training, not only those at the basic level, but training the policymakers, the people who can make the decisions, so that they have this gender perspective and it's applied to everything they do. So thank you for that. And now, coming last but not least, I'm going to turn to you, Paul Kirby. You are the co-director for the Gender Justice and Security Hub at LAC, and you're also fellow of the Center for Women, Peace and Security. So your research has focused a lot on the Women, Peace and Security implementation, on feminist policy, and on equality and peace. So my question to you is very short, but I know that the answer can't possibly be that short. It's how does gender matter?
Well, thank you so much, and for the opportunity to be with you all here today. I'd like to expand a little bit on what we mean when we talk about the gender perspective and some of the potential problems and tensions in that. So we live in a world where gender is recognized as a form of power as never before. There are still those, of course, who deny that gender inequality exists or who seek to justify it as natural. And we see a revival of chauvinistic movements and misogynistic violence in all sorts of places. Nevertheless, I want to suggest this evening that the more pressing question will not be whether gender matters, but precisely how. What vision of feminism with what institutional arrangements will take root? So on paper, as we've partly already heard, there is a general acceptance of the imperative to move beyond patriarchal security. 20 years after Security Council Resolution 1325, which began the Women, Peace and Security agenda, there are some 95 national action plans being released at such a rate that that figure might already be out of date. And we are rapidly approaching half of the world's governments having a national action plan. There have been declarations of feminist foreign policy by the governments of Sweden, Canada, France, Mexico, and others. And there are dozens of regional plans and strategies from the African Union, NATO, ASEAN, and the EU, among others. And of course, the 10 resolutions from the Security Council itself. And while we often criticize the slowness of implementation or the co-optation of some of the language, this remarkable list reflects a genuine political shift. Across the West, we are seeing a transformation, if a slow one, in the faces and the bodies that we associate with the concept of security. The last EU High Representative on Foreign Policy, the current President of the European Commission, defense and security ministers in several European states, MEPs who are engaged on these issues. Over the Atlantic, the composition of the new Biden administration, a more inclusive representation of America in the world, and measures like the creation of a Gender Policy Council. The shift is not only in leadership. Despite the low figures that we heard at the beginning, there are more women peacekeepers, police officers, and gender advisors than ever before. So I really want to stress that this transformation is hugely significant. It is at the very minimum progress on the right to participation, the realization of the insights, potential, and passion of peoples who have historically been excluded and exploited. But I also want to sound a note of caution, because in these competing visions of inclusion, the obligations and the kind of insights that we see differ, sometimes sharply. For example, there is still often a tendency to treat gender as synonymous with women, without consideration either of the different positions and privileges that women occupy, or to the harms experienced by men, arguably particularly in situations of conflict and war, again, varying depending on which men we are talking about. More, there is a real danger, a danger that feminist activists have always warned about, that the work of inclusion in existing institutions detracts from or even replaces a more comprehensive transformation of what security means and who it is for. So to take a deeply uncomfortable case for this particular forum, celebrating the inclusion of women in Frontex without attending to the wider effects of the EU's migration containment strategy, which practically guarantees increased vulnerability for women and men to horrendous gender-based violence in transit, interdiction, and detention in around Libya. 3 more fleeting examples to challenge our idea of what the gender perspective requires. First, disarmament. From World War I to the present, feminist social movements have advocated that the war system be radically undone, where governments pledge their support for WPS, while at the same time renewing their nuclear weapon capabilities and neglecting non-proliferation commitments. It is only one aspect of gender or patriarchy that is being challenged. Second, peace building. The question of participation that we often invoke when we talk about WPS has always had 2 sides. The participation of women in making and enforcing the most serious decisions about security, usually from a position in the global north. And on the other, the participation of women experiencing conflict in forging solutions and resolutions to that conflict, largely, but not always, in the global south. So despite a long history of demands to fund and dialogue with them, there is more attention today given to who leads organizations than to how the women affected by security decisions would design them themselves. And finally, structural violence. The WPS agenda has evolved to pay most attention to issues of sexual violence in conflict zones. Yet the gender perspective is not just about the intensity and horror of such acts, which can too easily be accommodated within a traditional protection paradigm, but also the multiple forms of displacement, exploitation, destitution, and harm that have a gender basis. Think, for example, of climate change, or its close relation, resource extraction. So what unites these examples is the recognition of patriarchy not just as the relative presence of men, or of certain masculine identities and privileges, but of a whole way of being in the world and structuring it, a legacy that persists in our institutions and our thinking. So I want to end by suggesting that we should think carefully about what we commit to when we say that it is time for security to move past patriarchy. Maybe that's something we can discuss. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan, and thank you for being so thought-provoking and bringing us these examples. I completely agree that it's not a matter of numbers and having more women in institutions or at the table. It's about focusing at gender lens and also rethinking what security means if we want to achieve a security that's for all, that's inclusive, and doesn't care about gender, race, or minorities. So this is very... Thank you so much. I think it'd be very nice for the audience to come in. Also, I think you've raised a question. Please don't be shy. You can raise your hand. You can ask something in the chat. We will bring you in. And yeah, just maybe if you have a question or you want to answer to Paul's question, just do so. Don't be shy. So I do know that Fernando, Fernando Aguiar from the Brussels International Center, you are very interested in some of Paul's work that talks about a topic that we have already discussed, masculinities and the culture within the security sector. So maybe, Fernando, if you want to address your question to Paul.
Yes, thank you, Elena. I do have a question. I do have many questions, but I think Paul addressed the issue very well. And I have a question to him, but that is broader to the other speakers as well. Because as we know, during this discussion, we have put a special emphasis on the need to increase the presence of women in military forces and security sector more generally, indicating how much effective peace operations will be if we increase the number of females in the military. We can assume that this emphasis is made with good intentions, but we can also, this assumption can also add an extra burden on women and create high expectation due to the peaceful features that they would bring to conflict resolution or to within the military institutions. This burden, however, is not placed on men. So I have a question on how can we make sure that both male and female are equally represented in contexts where both can bring an added value? This is a question to all the speakers, most specifically maybe to Marie and to Paul as well.
Okay, Marie, do you want to come in and address this question, please?
Yeah, I can try. I do believe that in the Swedish armed forces we have core values which states that we are equal soldiers, and I think there is a danger in having different expectations because of what gender you are, that you have different magic abilities based on your gender to be able to participate in a mission, because you are trained as a soldier and you have that training. It's not important if you are a woman or a man. You have a mission to solve, and you're a specialist or you're a commander. You know how to handle your equipment, and you take care of your team, and you have a mission to solve. So if I can participate in a team and I am there because I am a woman, that sounds like I'm quoted, and I don't think that's a good idea at all. No, it should be based on my abilities as a human being and not my gender. So.
Okay. Thank you, Marie. Paul, this question was also addressed to you. Maybe you want to come in?
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Fernando. I mean, I think there's a operational or training aspect of this, which is simply that training on gender needs to be mandatory. It needs to be organization-wide. I'm very glad that you raised the point of the double burden. There can't be an expectation that simply because some people are embodied in a feminine form, they will therefore, without any additional training, be better at responding to sexual violence or better at empathetic communication, or any of those very loaded assumptions that sometimes come with the more essentialist versions of the WPS agenda. So I'm not an expert on what works technically within institutions, but that would, of course, be a starting point. I think more broadly, the difficulty, the tension, is how to communicate with men about patriarchy, about power. And we have a tension, I would suggest, between, on the one hand, the need to meet men where they are and to not immediately alienate them from the conversation, which very often means that advocates and activists use a language around, say, positive masculinity, in order to provide an alternative way of understanding manhood, which can open a certain kind of conversation for men, and where men can talk about their experiences. And of course, there isn't a kind of homogenous male experience there. It's interesting that Alan also raised the example of the language of toxic masculinity. That's another way in which we can help men distinguish between different kinds of identities without them having to reject manhood in its totality. But the difficulty with that approach is that it at the same time ends up centering men in the conversation again, and trying to overly perhaps reassure men rather than confronting them with perhaps the more difficult facts and histories of patriarchy. So I think in a lot of the movements to engage men in gender equality, we see that tension playing out in different kinds of ways. And sometimes there are paradoxes. So there have been some studies that suggest that advocating for positive masculinity or protective masculinity as a solution to sexual violence does decrease sexual violence, but it ends up increasing other kinds of patriarchal behaviors, such as control over whether a female partner can see their friends in certain situations, control over joint finances, and those sort of aspects which are also part of patriarchal behavior. So there's a tension running through there that I think organizations and all of us need to think about very carefully.
Thank you, Paul. And I think it's a very broad and interesting topic. Maybe we could even address it in a separate event, because I think there's a lot to say on this. We only have 5 more minutes left, but before we go, I would like to bring in Megan Bastick. I see that you have raised your hand, so please come and ask your question or remark.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for such a rich conversation. I had a quite specific question I wanted to ask Alan, following up some of his comments, but perhaps would also address to Marie if she finds it relevant. Alan, you mentioned the importance of working with defined outcomes, which I thought it's one of those almost dry things to say, but is really, really powerful, that we talk about concepts like inclusion and diversity, but unless you really have outcomes, you can't hold institutions to account. So I wanted to ask you, you talked about staff surveys and questionnaires. Do you have any ideas or suggestions for understanding the experiences of LGBTI staff that you can use in environments where the discriminatory characteristics of the institution is that you are such that you can't ask them to openly identify themselves? So for example, tools or techniques that you can use in a homophobic institution to try and understand how LGBTI staff are experiencing their workplace. Thank you.
So yes, please, Alan and Cohen.
Thank you, and excellent question, I might say. I talked about specific outcomes, defined outcomes, and how do you measure those within the context of the framework you described can be difficult. Clearly, anonymity around any kind of staff survey is vitally important. Bring in, for example, an outside organisation, a university, college, who may be versed at analysing that data and keep that data anonymous. Is one way I think you can slightly overcome the fear of response to that, and to be able to speak openly about these issues. You have the wider cultural aspect. I think Paul kind of addressed a bit of that, is the fact that military and police are uniform organisations, not in the sense of wearing uniform all the time. It is about uniformity. So people tend to go with certain ideas within those organisations. The word would maybe perhaps be acquiescence. We acquiesce to what tends to be the prevailing culture, the prevailing ideas within the organisation, regardless of our gender or sexual orientation or transgender identity. These are things that need to be challenged robustly within an organisation, need to be talked about within the organisation. And as Maria said, this needs leadership within the organisation to drive it. So the part that I mentioned about policy to practice, it needs to be driven policy. It can't just be policy on paper. So there needs to be key leadership, there needs to be key outcomes for the policy into practice delivery. And how we then measure that is vital. Things like exit interviews, things like staff surveys, very important, but I would bring in outside agencies to conduct those to perhaps help overcome some of those cultural barriers that exist.
Thank you, Alan, for sharing this, and I hope that it was helpful. For our last question, I would like to turn to Crystal. Our colleague Crystal has been monitoring the questions that our viewers via live stream have been putting on Twitter. So, Crystal, could you share one of those questions with us?
Absolutely. Can you hear me, Elena?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So one of the questions that we have today is, what concrete changes can national government and the EU take to ensure active inclusion of LGBTQI individuals rather than the minimum guarantee, of lack of discrimination?
Okay, so I don't know, maybe Hannah, I know that you have to leave very soon. I don't know if you have the time to answer this question. Yes? Okay,
yes,
thank
I
you.
can take this question, and I actually would also like to comment on something that Marie said, because for me, and that would also be the answer to the question, it really boils down to political will. And I was just looking at the numbers of women in the police forces in our security index, which I think you also quoted in the beginning when you talked about the numbers of years it would still take. And I think last year, the number of women in the Portuguese police forces was 8%, so 0.8. And in Lithuania, it was already up to 38. So that's 30% more women in two countries that kind of have the same point to start from. So that's what I mean. If there is a willingness for change, the change can be there and can be quite quickly. And what can we do more than trying to prevent discrimination? For me, a very important moment was actually when Stoltenberg, the one who is head of NATO, which is one of the most military organizations maybe that you can imagine, started a speech with the words, "I am a feminist." And that's something that was really shaking some stereotypes around the world, also in some of the Western European countries. And I think it's also this very proactive, strong commitment from people leading organizations where we may not expect it. But it's really this change, I think, also of attitude that's coming from the top, that especially in hierarchical organizations, which the security sector still is, really trickles down quickly.
Okay, thank you very much, Hannah. And Alan, maybe as part of the European LGBT Police Association, you'd like to join this question?
Oh, sorry. I'm having problems with my mute button. Yes, the question is, again, an excellent one. I think it goes back to things I've said previously about leadership, but one idea which we certainly have found quite effective in the UK and in Scotland in particular was things such as reverse mentoring. So where you have a mentoring program, whether that be around gender or LGBT or race, then why not just turn that around and do what could be like reverse mentoring? So the people who are actually making some of these decisions for gender and LGBT, who may not be from that community, from that background, could benefit from experiences around being reverse mentored. So people from a different gender, from different gender identity, from different sexual orientations, could actually help those people gain more experience and knowledge about those areas, about the issues that are affected by those people. And organizations can adopt reverse mentoring programs just as they could adopt mentoring programs, which help to develop staff within those organizations. So that's one idea which might be worth considering with your organizations.
So thank you, Alan. Reverse mentoring, I think that is just a great idea. And on that note, I think we have to finish for today. Thank you all so much for joining us, especially to our 4 speakers. I think this debate has been very insightful, and there have been very good recommendations that I do hope that reach our policymakers, so that this kind of event is less necessary and relevant. So just before you go, I would like to inform you and let you know that in a couple of weeks, on the 30th of March, we will be having John Bew for number 10 and Samantha Jobs, who's the Director for Defence and Security at the Foreign Commonwealth Office, to discuss the new UK integrated review on security, defence, development and foreign policy. We will discuss what the review means and also what the impact that will have in Euro-Atlantic cooperation. So you can find more information on our website, and we will send you an invitation. So please join us again. Thank you so much for joining us today. I do hope to see you very soon, and take care and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.